Step quietly into the shadows of the detective podcast. Tonight, a mystery stirs in the darkness, but first, we want to know who's joining us tonight. Share your city and country in the comments and become part of our web of curious minds. Take a deep breath. The investigation begins. Chapter 1. The night in Paris had taken on a peculiar stillness, the sort that made the gas lamps flicker with unease and the fog seem almost sentient. Curling through the narrow streets, as though whispering secrets meant for no one at all. In a modest apartment overlooking those shadowed lanes, Auguste Dupin sat alone in the dim sitting room, a single candle burning low upon the table beside him. When his companion returned later than usual, wearied by the ordinary affairs of the day, he found Dupin already there, absorbed in a book. Dupin looked up briefly, his eyes catching the candlelight with a familiar glint, a mixture of amusement and quiet apprehension that had, on many occasions, signaled the beginning of some intricate puzzle. "Have you heard, my friend?" Dupin asked softly, his voice restrained yet charged with intensity. "Something most unaccountable has occurred in the Rue de la Verrerie." The other man leaned back, instinctively cautious. Though experience had taught him that such caution was rarely useful, once Dupin's interest had been engaged. "Another theft," he suggested, "or perhaps a quarrel among the bourgeois." Dupin shook his head, his expression darkening. "No, this is far more intricate. A murder, one the authorities cannot comprehend. The reports contradict one another at every turn, leaving the imagination free to wander into absurdities." That phrasing alone suggested a crime unlike those they had encountered before. Curiosity, as always, overcame any lingering unease. "And what," his companion asked, "makes it so confounding?" Dupin rose and began to pace the room, his silhouette wavering in the candlelight. "It is not merely the act," he replied, "but the circumstances. The body was discovered under conditions that defy reason. Witnesses describe events that cannot logically coexist. And yet the evidence remains, irrefutable in presence, inscrutable in meaning." The air itself seemed to grow heavier as he spoke. Though Dupin's intellect was deeply admired, there were moments, this among them, when it inspired unease rather than comfort. Perhaps it was the suggestion that a criminal mind could be so carefully perverse, or perhaps the unsettling realization that Paris still concealed depths yet unseen. Soon after, the two men left their apartment and made their way toward the Rue de la Verrerie. The fog enveloped them like a cold shroud, muting the city's usual sounds. A distant carriage rattled over cobblestones. A lone dog barked somewhere unseen. Yet it was the silence that pressed most heavily upon the senses, laden with anticipation, as though unseen eyes watched from darkened windows and narrow alleys. The crime scene itself was enclosed by crude barriers and attended by officers whose confusion was evident. Curious citizens gathered at the edges, whispering in low, uneasy tones. Dupin's gaze moved ceaselessly, absorbing every detail. The uneven placement of a lantern, faint scuff marks upon the stones, a subtle scent lingering in the night air. "It is unusual," Dupin murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "The victim was found in a room locked from within, no forced entry, no sign of struggle, and yet the death was violent. How then was it accomplished?" Beyond the cordon lay the body, a young man, scarcely 25, his features pale and strangely serene, as though death had preserved a final expression of calm. His hands clutched a folded note, its edges crumpled, its writing indistinct from a distance. There was an unsettling order to the scene, a sense not merely of murder, but of arrangement, as though the killer had intended to leave behind a riddle rather than chaos. Dupin bent closer, studying the details with unnerving intensity. "Observe the candle," he said quietly, "placed precisely to illuminate the body, yet extinguished midway through its burn. and the chair shifted exactly 2 inches from its original position. Such precision is never accidental. There is meaning here. To an ordinary eye, the room appeared unremarkable. Yet under Dupin's scrutiny, every mundane object seemed charged with sinister intent. Before any further questions could be asked, a young officer approached, pale and visibly shaken. "Sir," he stammered, it makes no sense. The witnesses contradict one another. Some claim they saw a shadow leaving the room, others insist no one entered or left at all. The doors were locked. The windows secured from within." Dupin inclined his head calmly. "Precisely. The mind behind this crime intended confusion. Perception itself has been manipulated. We must look beyond appearances and search for design." When they finally withdrew into the fog-filled streets, a lingering sensation of being watched followed them. Each backward glance revealed only empty alleys, yet Dupin's attention remained fixed on the Rue de la Verrerie, his expression unreadable. "Do you believe," his companion asked cautiously, "that this is the work of a single mind? Might it not be some accident, a convergence of misfortune?" Dupin allowed himself a faint, almost melancholic smile. "I have little faith in accidents. They are merely the universe's way of mocking us. This is deliberate, an architecture of intellect and obsession. An obsession inevitably betrays itself through a flaw, however small." The fog thickened as they walked, gas lamps flickering past like watchful eyes. Though they had faced many enigmas together, never before had the city itself seemed so ominously alert, as though Paris were holding its breath. Back in their apartment, Dupin returned to his seat at the table. The candle cast long shadows across his face as he unfolded the note recovered from the scene, examining it with a care reserved for dangerous objects. "This," he murmured, "is not merely evidence. It is communication, a message crafted to puzzle, to unsettle, to manipulate perception itself." The implication sent a chill through the room. The thought that reality could be shaped or distorted by a calculating mind was deeply unsettling. Yet if anyone could unravel such a design, it was Dupin. That night, sleep came reluctantly. The image of the young man, peaceful in death, lingered in the mind long after the candle was extinguished. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, and distant bells tolled with mournful restraint. For in Paris, as the case had already begun to reveal, nothing was ever as it appeared, and a mind capable of such horrors was rarely content to remain silent. Chapter 2. The morning after their arrival at Rue de la Verrerie, the city seemed almost unwilling to resume its ordinary rhythm. Paris moved with mechanical precision, the merchants opening their shutters, the horses' hooves echoing through narrow streets, yet beneath it all lingered a tension that refused to be dispelled. Dupin and his companion returned to the scene, determined to study the crime from every conceivable angle, for it had already become evident that conventional observation would yield nothing. The officers were present in greater numbers than the previous night, yet their faces bore the same expressions of bewilderment, mingled with a touch of unease, rarely witnessed in men accustomed to violence. One of them approached cautiously, a tall, thin man whose hands trembled slightly as he extended a folded report. "Sir," he said, his voice tight with apprehension, "I have attempted to compile witness statements, but they are contradictory in every particular. Some assert the victim was alone when he entered his room. Others claim they glimpsed a figure moving behind the curtains. The details," he faltered, shaking his head. Dupin received the report without comment, merely scanning it with the faintest arch of his brow. "Contradiction is rarely without purpose," he said softly. "These discrepancies, though they seem chaotic, are clues in their own right. Observe carefully. Where the mind is manipulated, perception itself becomes a tool of deception." His companion followed him into the building, careful to note every detail. though it was impossible not to feel a creeping unease. The room where the body had been discovered appeared at first glance unremarkable. A modest apartment furnished with simple elegance, the windows closed, curtains drawn, and a faint trace of candle wax on the floor. Yet Dupin's gaze swept over the scene as though seeking something invisible. "Notice," he murmured, "the subtle abrasion along the door frame. One might dismiss it as ordinary wear, yet its position is peculiar, a clue, perhaps, to the manner of entry or of exit." The impossibility of the crime troubled the observer deeply. How could the victim have been attacked within a locked room? No forced entry, no broken lock, no evidence of any weapon left behind. Even the slightest disturbance seemed absent. "It appears impossible," he said quietly. "How could any assailant have entered or departed without leaving a trace?" Dupin's lips curved in a shadow of a smile. "That is precisely why it is of interest. The mind behind this act is clever, and it exploits our assumptions. When the obvious path is obstructed, the mind seeks solutions where none exist. And therein lies its mistake, the subtle imperfection." They examined the note found in the victim's hands. Unlike the scribbled message glimpsed the night before, it could now be studied more closely. The handwriting was precise, almost painstakingly neat, yet it contained minute inconsistencies in the spacing of letters and the angle of certain strokes. "A deliberate distortion," Dupin said, "intended to mislead the casual observer. The content is secondary. It is the manner of composition that speaks to the character of the author." His companion could scarcely follow the intricacies of the observation. Even in his most attentive moments, he had never perceived such small variances in penmanship as significant. Dupin, however, seemed attuned to every imperceptible irregularity, as if the city itself had become a puzzle written in subtle gestures. The neighbors were interviewed once more. One elderly woman claimed she had heard a muffled cry around midnight, though she could not say whether it emanated from the victim's apartment or elsewhere. A baker insisted he had seen a shadow detach itself from the doorway moments before dawn, yet when questioned further, he could not describe the figure. Another witness, a young servant, recalled nothing at all. Each testimony contradicted the others in the smallest yet most confounding particulars. The officers despaired, scribbling down accounts that seemed to cancel one another out. Dupin, by contrast, absorbed them like a prism absorbs light, seeking the pattern hidden beneath. "Observe," he said, pausing to gesture at a faint trail of dust along the window sill. "Even when perception falters, traces remain. A footprint, a dislocated object, the very arrangement of furniture, these speak in whispers. The criminal underestimates such evidence, believing that human error or oversight will protect his scheme. And often it does not. A small detail caught his companion's attention, the victim's chair slightly askew as if pushed aside in haste. The candle, still faintly warm, had burned unevenly. The wax pooled at a sharp angle rather than symmetrically. The window, though closed, bore faint streaks on the glass that might have been left by fingers, or by condensation manipulated by a clever hand. "It is as though the room itself conspires to deceive us," he said, a shiver running down his spine. "Indeed," Dupin replied, "and in deception lies revelation. The impossibility of the crime is its own clue. By presenting us with a paradox, the criminal exposes his method, if only we are astute enough to discern it." The day drew on, and the fog, relentless and cold, enveloped the city as if to hide it from scrutiny. Dupin remained unwavering, pacing, observing, and occasionally making cryptic notes on a small piece of paper he always carried. His companion could see his mind at work, connecting impressions that seemed almost alien in their precision. Suddenly, Dupin stopped. His eyes, dark and luminous, fixed on a seemingly trivial detail, a faint smear along the hallway floor outside the victim's door. "Notice this," he said. "It is slight, nearly invisible to the inattentive, yet it is a sign of passage, footsteps that did not belong or that were deliberately mislaid. The criminal was cautious, yes, but not infallible. The flaw is here." The observer leaned in, straining to detect what Dupin had seen. There was indeed a subtle variation in the dust, a streak darker than the surrounding powder. Alone, it meant nothing, but under Dupin's scrutiny it became significant. Then in a low voice, almost a whisper, Dupin spoke again. "The misdirection is deliberate, and yet the author of this crime is impatient. He left a thread for us to follow, though he believes no one will perceive it. The solution lies not in the body, nor the weapon, nor the witnesses, but in the mind that orchestrated the impossible." A cold dread settled over his companion. This was no ordinary murder. It was a game, a challenge laid before them by a mind far sharper and more calculating than any previously encountered. And with unsettling certainty, he realized that the criminal was likely observing them even now, confident in the strength of his deception. As they departed the scene, Dupin's expression remained inscrutable. He spoke little, his thoughts clearly occupied elsewhere, yet there was a thrill in his demeanor, a mixture of anticipation and analytical satisfaction, as though he had glimpsed the shape of chaos itself. His companion, however, could not shake the sense that they were stepping deeper into peril, drawn forward by the very intellect that fascinated and unsettled him. Upon returning to their apartment, the events of the day refused to loosen their grip. The contradictions, the paradoxes, the subtle manipulations, it was as though Paris itself had conspired to confound them. Dupin's calm certainty offered some reassurance, though only partially, for it was clear that what lay ahead would test not only reason but the very boundaries of perception. And there lingered an unspoken fear, that the mind behind the murder possessed an intimacy with human thought far deeper than either of them could fully anticipate. Night fell again, heavier than before, bringing with it a silence that seemed to wait for their next move. Somewhere in the shadows, the criminal smiled at the unfolding of his impossibility, and the city of Paris, unaware, continued to breathe beneath the fog. Chapter 3. The morning fog hung low as they returned to Rue de la Verrerie, its weight pressing down upon the streets, muffling footsteps and cloaking the city in a quiet dread. The impossibility of the previous days, events lingered in the companion's mind like a persistent shadow. Each step toward the crime scene felt as if they were approaching a secret the city itself wished to conceal. Dupin walked ahead, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning the surroundings as though the buildings themselves might whisper clues to him. "It is remarkable," Dupin began without preamble, "how the mind of a criminal often leaves patterns unseen by those untrained to observe. Chaos, my friend, is frequently structured. Apparent randomness conceals intention." His companion nodded, though he was far from certain he could perceive these hidden structures. The officers had been equally confounded by the previous day's contradictions, leaving the field clear for Dupin to scrutinize the minutiae. Even he, accustomed to Dupin's methods, could not help but feel overwhelmed by the subtlety of his observations. The room itself appeared unchanged, yet the details seemed to shift when examined through Dupin's discerning eyes. He crouched beside the desk where the victim had kept a ledger, its pages scattered, though curiously untouched in their most vital entries. "Observe these papers," he said, tilting a page toward the dim candlelight. "The ledger was disturbed, yes, yet only superficially. Notice that some lines are underlined, others slightly smudged. At first glance, one might deem this random, yet it speaks to a deliberate hand seeking distraction rather than destruction." His companion leaned closer, examining the markings. Indeed, there seemed no logic to the smudges, no immediate pattern, yet Dupin's certainty suggested otherwise. "But why?" he asked, bewildered. Why obscure in this manner? The mind that commits such a crime thrives upon misdirection, Dupin replied. It wishes the observer to chase shadows, to believe in multiple narratives. Yet each misstep is itself a clue, an invitation to perceive the truth hidden beneath deliberate chaos. They spent hours retracing every footprint, every scuff, every subtle alteration of the furniture. Dupin measured distances, aligned angles, and even noted the reflections in the small mirror above the mantel. "Notice," he said finally, pointing to a faint reflection, "how the candlelight would have illuminated certain features if observed from a specific angle." The perpetrator anticipated observation, yet miscalculated the observer's height, a small but telling imperfection. His companion marveled at Dupin's acuity, though unease settled upon him. The criminal had anticipated the police, the witnesses, and even the ordinary eye, but perhaps not Dupin's. The thought was as thrilling as it was terrifying. Their examination was interrupted by the arrival of a new witness, a young man named Philippe, who claimed to have been in the building at the time of the murder. He described seeing a figure in the hallway, tall and indistinct, who disappeared into a side corridor before the police could arrive. His account was vivid, yet contradictory to every other testimony they had heard. Dupin listened in silence, his eyes narrowing. "You are certain of this corridor?" he asked. "Yes, monsieur," Philippe insisted. "I saw the shadow move, then vanish." "And yet no one else corroborates this sighting," Dupin pressed. Philippe hesitated. "No, but I know what I saw." I am certain." Dupin's expression remained inscrutable. Certainty is often the enemy of observation. The mind convinces itself of events that did not occur, particularly under stress or fear. And yet, he paused, examining Philippe's face. "There may be truth concealed within your conviction, hidden as if under a veil." After Philippe departed, Dupin turned to his companion with a glint in his eyes. "There are multiple layers here. The apparent contradictions are not merely errors or confusion. They are the deliberate scaffolding of perception. We must examine not only what is seen, but what is withheld, what is suggested, and what is conveniently obscured." He then led him to the small study where the victim often entertained visitors. The table was set with an array of objects: a book open to a random page, a glass half filled with water, a quill resting atop an inkwell. On the surface, the scene seemed innocuous, perhaps even ordinary. Yet Dupin's gaze pierced each object with relentless scrutiny. "Each element," he said, "has been arranged to communicate indirectly. Consider the book, why left open to this page? Why this glass half full rather than empty or full? These choices appear trivial, yet they form a pattern. The criminal relishes the small stage, the controlled tableau, believing it inconsequential. And yet it reveals his hand." His companion followed the reasoning as best he could, noting the peculiar angles, the faint impressions in the carpet, the subtle asymmetry of the furnishings. Dupin continued, "We are not merely observing a murder, we are observing the mind behind the murder. And as is always the case, a mind that overplays its hand leaves the faintest trace of vanity, of impatience, of flaw." Hours passed, the city outside dimming as dusk approached. Yet the investigation remained unbroken. Dupin examined every facet of the scene with meticulous care, cataloging discrepancies, contradictions, and irregularities. Yet no final solution emerged. Each answer seemed to invite more questions. "Notice," Dupin said suddenly, pointing to a faint streak on the floorboards near the window, "how this dust has been deliberately disturbed. It suggests movement, an entrance or exit, but also conceals the direction. The criminal intends for this ambiguity to confound the untrained mind." Yet the pattern is discernible. His companion stared, straining to understand. To the ordinary eye, the marks were negligible, almost imperceptible, yet Dupin's clarity rendered them vital. "And what of the witnesses' contradictions?" he asked. "Are they all part of the pattern as well?" "Indeed," Dupin replied. "Some recall details that never occurred, others omit facts. The contradictions are instruments of misdirection. The mind that orchestrates these events wishes to manipulate perception as carefully as it manipulates physical objects. In essence, the crime itself is a puzzle, and each witness, whether aware or not, contributes a piece." The realization left his companion uneasy. The murder was not simply a violent act. It was a performance, a study in manipulation and perception. Every testimony, every object, every subtle imperfection had been placed with care, calculated to obscure the truth while guiding the observant toward it. As night fell, Dupin finally straightened, his expression contemplative yet resolute. "We have discerned fragments of the design, but not yet its entirety. Patience is required. The criminal has overplayed only slightly. The remainder will reveal itself in due course, provided we continue to watch, to think, and to notice the smallest deviation from the expected." They left the building with a sense of awe tempered by dread. The impossible crime had become, if not yet solvable, at least comprehensible in its intention. A pattern existed, hidden in plain sight, and it was a pattern of the mind itself, a mind precise, patient, and obsessive. Yet a shadow lingered unspoken. If the criminal had anticipated observation to such a degree, might he also anticipate their methods? And if so, what unforeseen measure awaited them in the depths of this puzzle? Perhaps a measure beyond reason or expectation. As they walked home beneath the flickering lamps, the fog pressing close to their faces, an unfamiliar chill settled over Dupin's companion. This murder, he realized, was not merely an act to be solved. It was a challenge, a deliberate confrontation issued by a mind both brilliant and dangerous. And it was not yet clear whether intellect alone would suffice to meet it. The night grew heavier, and the streets darker, yet Dupin's calm composure offered a slender reassurance. Still, it was evident that the hidden pattern they had begun to discern was only the first layer, and that the true shape of this impossible crime lay buried deeper, awaiting discovery in shadows darker than any Parisian fog. Chapter 4. The streets of Paris had become less familiar with each passing day, transformed by the investigation into a labyrinth of suspicion and subtle terror. Fog lingered like a living thing, curling around lamp posts and alleyways, hiding both the innocent and the sinister. Dupin's companion had begun to feel a creeping unease, one not entirely dispelled by Dupin's presence. There was an intensity about Dupin, a ferocity in his intellect, that drew him forward even as it unsettled every instinct. That evening, Dupin proposed they revisit a location connected to the victim's acquaintances, a tavern in the Marais district, frequented by those whose lives skirted the borders of legality. "The answers," he said, "rarely reside in the places we imagine. The underworld, where secrecy is law, often holds the keys to the puzzles of civility." His companion followed reluctantly, noting the tavern's exterior, a narrow doorway beneath a peeling sign, the faint scent of smoke and spilled wine lingering in the air. Inside, the room was dim, lit by a single lantern swinging above the bar, its glow reflecting in the eyes of patrons who observed them with mild suspicion. Dupin's gaze swept the room, calculating, noting each gesture, each twitch, as though invisible lines of connection ran between every inhabitant. They approached the barkeep, a stout man with a red nose and wary eyes. "We seek knowledge of those who frequented the Rue de la Verrerie," Dupin said smoothly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Specifically, anyone who might have had reason to watch or follow the young man recently deceased." The man hesitated, glancing nervously at the other patrons. "Many come and go," he said finally. "I do not know who to believe, and the rest, they do not speak freely." Dupin leaned in slightly. You will speak freely with me, for I am not one who misinterprets lies as truth. And perhaps if you aid me, justice may yet prevail." The barkeep swallowed hard. His eyes flickered to a shadowed corner where two men whispered urgently to one another, then back to Dupin. Finally, he gestured to a table near the back. There is someone who might help, a man called Leclerc. He knows more than he should and less than you wish." Dupin nodded, his lips tight, and they moved to the corner. Leclerc, thin and sallow, greeted them with a wary glance, his hands trembling slightly. "I heard of the murder," he whispered, eyes darting to the other patrons. "They say nothing can explain it, that the city itself is baffled, but there are truths that no one dares utter." "Then speak them," Dupin said softly, with an intensity that made the man flinch. Leclerc swallowed again. "There are whispers of obsession," he murmured. The young man, he had enemies, perhaps not of flesh and blood, but of intellect, men who envied his position, his mind. And there are others, figures in shadows, unseen but watching. Some claim they can control events from afar, manipulating perception so the victims cannot see the trap until it is too late. A chill ran through Dupin's companion, for the words carried a weight beyond mere tavern gossip. Dupin's eyes, however, gleamed with recognition. "Precisely," he murmured, "and these are the shadows we must explore. Obsession can be as deadly as any weapon, and manipulation, when executed with cunning, renders the ordinary mind helpless." Leclerc nodded nervously. "There is more, something about the night, about a window. The victim sometimes spoke of feeling watched, of a presence he could not see." The police dismissed it as imagination, but Dupin's expression darkened. But he perceived correctly. Fear, when properly applied, can mislead the mind, and yet, in some instances, it alerts it to danger it cannot yet articulate. "We must follow this instinct further." They left the tavern and navigated narrow alleys, their wet cobblestones slick beneath their boots. Each shadow seemed to twist unnaturally, and Dupin's companion found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once. Dupin walked steadily ahead, unafraid, yet there was a calculated tension in his movements, as if he anticipated a trap unknown to the other. They arrived at the victim's former residence, now empty, yet Dupin's attention was drawn to faint markings along the stairwell, subtle abrasions that suggested someone had ascended in haste. "Notice," he said quietly, "the sequence of disturbances. One would assume a simple passage, yet each mark is deliberately misleading, creating an illusion of randomness to conceal intent." His companion stared at the scratches, bewildered. "How can you tell?" he asked, incredulous. "Observation," Dupin replied, "and the understanding of obsession. A mind consumed by meticulous calculation leaves traces, even as it masks them. The criminal believes he can dictate perception, yet leaves the smallest inconsistency, enough for an observant eye to follow." A sudden noise made them both turn. From a darkened doorway, a figure emerged, hurrying down the street, vanishing before they could call out. Dupin's eyes followed the retreating shadow. "Patience," he murmured. "The desperate always reveal themselves. Observe the pattern, not the movement." They spent the remainder of the night tracing back streets, examining windows, noting the subtle disturbances of air, the displaced dust, the faint impressions in the mud. Each element, trivial alone, formed a web of clues when considered collectively. Yet despite the clarity Dupin drew from the chaos, his companion could not dispel a rising sense of dread. The criminal was not merely clever, he was omnipresent, as though aware of each step they took. When they returned home, the candlelight seemed dimmer, the apartment colder than usual. Dupin sat, hands folded, eyes distant, lost in thought. His companion could not tell whether he relished the challenge or feared the depths to which it might lead. "You see," Dupin said finally, breaking the silence, "to unravel this mystery, we must enter shadows not merely of the city but of the human mind. The criminal's intellect surpasses mere cunning. It ventures into obsession, into the precise manipulation of fear. And here in these shadows lies the danger not to the body but to reason itself. A shiver passed through his companion, for Dupin spoke not only of the murderer, but of the very process of understanding him. Each discovery, each observation, risked drawing him into the same web of psychological peril, where certainty was a luxury and perception a constant threat. The night passed slowly and sleep remained elusive. He lay awake, recalling the shadowy figure, the slight abrasions on the stairs, the faint smells of damp wood and extinguished candle smoke. The pattern Dupin discerned seemed almost supernatural in its coherence, yet his mind resisted full understanding. And he could not help but wonder how much of Dupin's brilliance served as a shield against the terror that accompanied such insight. As the first hint of dawn crept through the narrow window, it became clear that they were far from resolution. Paris, beneath its ordinary bustle, concealed an intelligence both malignant and precise. And the mind behind this crime was already several steps ahead, orchestrating events with a meticulousness that inspired fear, not only for the victims, but for the fragile logic upon which their own reasoning depended. That night the city seemed to hold its breath. Tomorrow, perhaps, the shadows would reveal more. And as always, Dupin's calm determination was both a comfort and a warning. The investigation had carried them far beyond ordinary peril, into a domain where intellect and obsession intersected, and where the next revelation might prove as dangerous as the murder itself. Chapter 5. By the next morning, Paris had returned to its usual clamor, yet the mystery continued to cast its long shadow over Rue de la Verrerie. News of the investigation had reached the local press, and the police, emboldened by the testimonies they had gathered, seemed increasingly confident in their conclusions. Dupin, however, greeted their triumph with the same quiet skepticism that had become his hallmark. The authorities had announced that the murder had likely been the work of a young man recently associated with the victim, a petty debtor whose motives, they claimed, were clear. He had been seen arguing with the victim days before the death, and his presence in the neighborhood around the time of the murder was confirmed by multiple witnesses. To the public the case was solved, and to the officers it seemed a tidy conclusion, yet Dupin was not convinced. He and his companion returned to the scene, ostensibly to review the evidence, but in reality to observe the details that the police had overlooked. The victim's room, now cleaned and slightly rearranged, bore the faintest traces of disturbance that, to a casual observer, might seem inconsequential. "Observe, my friend," Dupin said, kneeling near the desk, "how the police have rearranged the ledger and straightened the furniture. They believe tidiness reflects truth, yet the very act of tidying has concealed the subtle imperfection, the one that marks the mind behind the crime." His companion peered at the desk, seeing nothing that stood out. Dupin's eyes, however, detected every nuance. "The false solution," he murmured, "is the greatest danger to the investigator. It lulls the mind into complacency, offering satisfaction while obscuring the truth." Dupin moved to the window, where a faint streak in the dust caught his attention. "Notice how this trace runs contrary to the supposed path of the culprit. The officers have assumed the sequence of movement based on witness statements, yet the dust contradicts them entirely. The path of the mind rarely coincides with the path of the body." A knock at the door announced the arrival of Inspector Gervais, who carried with him an air of triumph. "Monsieur Dupin," he said, bowing stiffly, "I presume you have heard. The suspect has been apprehended. His guilt is evident. The witnesses corroborate, and the evidence leaves little room for doubt." Dupin's response was deliberate, almost casual. "Indeed, I have heard." And yet, he said, letting the word linger like a shadow, I remain uncertain whether the solution aligns with the deeper facts of the case. Gervais frowned. You imply what? That our investigation is flawed, that the truth escapes us. I imply nothing beyond the observation that appearances deceive more often than they reveal. The truth may reside beneath layers of perception, obscured by assumption and error. After the inspector departed, Dupin turned to his companion with a faint smile. Now comes the most dangerous stage, my friend. The mind is inclined to embrace simplicity when complexity is available. The police have found a suspect and established a narrative that satisfies the ordinary observer. But satisfaction is rarely a guarantor of accuracy. They return to the tavern in the Marais to seek additional information, hoping that the shadows might yet yield a perspective overlooked. There, a few patrons whispered cautiously among themselves, avoiding their gaze. Dupin's eyes, ever watchful, caught subtle gestures, a hand brushing over a table, a shiver, a glance toward the window. These people, he said softly, hold fragments of the puzzle, though they speak only when compelled. Fear and caution are potent deterrents to truth, yet the observant mind can discern meaning from avoidance, from hesitation, even from silence itself. One elderly man, leaning heavily on a cane, finally offered a clue. The suspect believed guilty, he claimed, had been seen in a distant quarter far from the scene, at a time that contradicted the supposed timeline. The officers had dismissed this, convinced of the suspect's presence by the weight of circumstantial evidence. Dupin's eyes gleamed. Observe, he whispered, how certainty can blind even the most diligent. It is the illusion of resolution that endangers comprehension. They followed this thread, visiting side streets and alleys, tracing the faintest impressions left by pedestrians, wind, and fog. Dupin moved with deliberate care, noting footprints partially obscured by morning rain, examining the arrangement of discarded papers, and observing the minutest details of window latches and door hinges. The false solution, he said finally, kneeling to inspect a small scratch on the threshold, ignores the subtle signature of the criminal. He operates not merely in space but in psychology. Each action is calculated to mislead, to create a narrative that satisfies expectation while concealing reality. And the police, having embraced the obvious, overlooked these signatures entirely. His companion felt a rising frustration. The suspect seemed a convenient scapegoat, yet Dupin's insistence on pursuing subtlety suggested a far more intricate scheme. But what if this person did act in some minor way, he asked. Could it be that the crime is both real and simple? Dupin shook his head. Rarely, my friend. Complexity is seldom fabricated without purpose. The criminal has constructed a narrative designed to seem accessible while remaining impenetrable. A superficial action may occur, yes, but it is a distraction, a lure for those content with superficial understanding. Our task is to discern the design beneath the distraction. Night fell as they returned to the Rue de la Verrerie. The street seemed quieter than ever, and the room where the victim had died retained a sense of suspended time. Dupin walked slowly around the room, examining the arrangement of chairs, the position of the windows, the subtle depressions in the floor where the candle had burned. The mind behind this crime, he said finally, has prepared traps for both the living and the observant. False solutions are their most insidious creation. They reassure, they pacify, and yet they mislead entirely. Our task is to navigate the illusion, to detect the imperfection beneath the perfection. His companion watched as Dupin paused by the window, his hand tracing a faint streak in the dust. Do you see it? Dupin asked. This mark contradicts the assumed path of the guilty party. It reveals a hand unseen, a presence denied by the narrative embraced by authority. There is a pattern here, hidden beneath layers of assumption, and the solution awaits those willing to pierce the veil. A chill settled over his companion. The police were confident, the city whispered of closure, and yet the truth remained elusive, embedded in shadows and subtle traces. Dupin's confidence was unwavering, but even his intensity could not dispel the dread that the mind responsible for the murder might be several steps ahead, orchestrating perception as meticulously as the act itself. Before leaving, Dupin lingered by the desk, examining the ledger once more. "Patience," he said almost to himself. "The false solution is seductive, yet temporary. Soon the criminal's impatience will betray him, and the pattern, previously hidden, will emerge in its entirety. But we must resist the allure of the obvious. It is a snare as lethal as the dagger itself." As they stepped into the fog-laden street, his companion realized that the city had become not merely a backdrop, but a participant in the crime, a maze of light and shadow, of observation and misdirection, through which they must navigate with caution and insight. And above all, he understood that the apparent resolution, the capture of the suspect, was but a mirage, a carefully constructed illusion masking the deeper, far more dangerous truth. That night, as they returned to their lodgings, he could not shake a sense of foreboding. The criminal had played his hand with precision, leaving the world believing the mystery solved, while the true architect remained hidden, manipulating events from beyond reach. Dupin's calm, methodical reasoning offered some comfort, yet the tension in the air suggested that the coming days would test not only their intellect but their courage, and perhaps even their sanity. Chapter 6. The city seemed to hum with a quiet malevolence as Dupin and his companion returned to their lodgings. Paris, cloaked in fog and faint gaslight, appeared ordinary to the casual observer. Yet to them, it was a stage meticulously arranged by a mind far more cunning than any they had encountered. Dupin's eyes, ever calculating, scanned each shadow, each reflection, as though the city itself whispered secrets meant only for him. "I believe the time has come," Dupin said quietly, "to set a trap not for the body nor for evidence but for the mind. The criminal relies upon perception, on subtle misdirection, on the manipulation of fear, and it is precisely there that he is vulnerable." His companion frowned. "But how can one trap a mind? We do not know his identity, nor his methods, nor even his ultimate objective." "That is precisely why psychology is our most potent weapon," Dupin replied. "The mind that obsesses over control cannot resist the illusion of opportunity. And in the illusion, it will betray itself." Their first step was to plant subtle observations, carefully orchestrated rumors whispered to the few who had knowledge of the crime. Dupin instructed his companion to converse with tavern patrons, noting how the smallest detail, a misplaced ledger, an open window, a half-finished drink, might travel back to the perpetrator through the invisible channels of gossip. "Every word," he said, "every implication is a lure. Minds obsessed with perfection cannot resist the temptation to correct, to adjust, to reveal themselves." That night, they returned to the scene of the crime. The room itself seemed unchanged, though Dupin had subtly repositioned a few items. A chair slightly askew, a book open to a different page, a candle lit where previously it had gone cold. To an ordinary eye, the differences were negligible, yet they were deliberate provocations designed to test the criminal's response. "Observe," Dupin whispered, "how the criminal will perceive the smallest anomaly as a challenge. A mind driven by meticulous calculation cannot abide imperfection. It will seek to restore order, and in doing so, it exposes its presence." They waited in silence through the long hours of the night. The city outside was subdued, the fog heavy, yet their anticipation was keen. And then, faint as a whisper, a disturbance, the creak of floorboards almost imperceptible, followed by a shadow crossing the threshold. Dupin's eyes narrowed. "He approaches," he murmured. "Do not breathe and observe." From the corner of the room, a figure moved cautiously, hands trembling as it reached for the ledger, adjusting its pages with a meticulousness that betrayed obsession. The face was not clearly visible, yet the posture, the hesitation, the precise movements, all spoke to a mind consumed with control. Dupin remained calm, yet the intensity of his calculation was unmistakable. "Notice," he said softly, "how he hesitates before touching each object. Every gesture is deliberate, every pause a testament to his need to correct what he perceives as disorder. It is the vulnerability of obsession." The figure lingered only briefly, as if sensing unseen eyes. A sudden gust of wind disturbed the candle, causing a flicker of shadow across the room. The intruder flinched, nearly dropping the ledger, and in that moment of uncertainty, Dupin's trap took effect. "Observe," he said, motioning toward the window, "how the criminal reacts to suggestion, not confrontation. He perceives himself as unobserved, yet the room has been orchestrated to imply scrutiny. Fear combined with his compulsive nature forces error." Sure enough, the figure made a mistake, small, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable to Dupin. A footstep landed upon the dust, in a place that revealed the direction of movement. A handprint pressed upon the glass, in a way that contradicted the calculated path, intended to conceal identity. Dupin's lips curved slightly. Patience and subtlety yield truth where brute force cannot. The mind reveals itself in its own need to dominate. They followed the traces as the intruder fled, the city's fog concealing but never erasing the evidence of obsessive correction. Dupin traced the movements, interpreting each displacement of furniture, each smudge of dust, as though reading the handwriting of the criminal's psyche. "The error is minor," he said finally, "yet sufficient. The criminal cannot help but expose himself when provoked psychologically, and this error is the first of several. The more he believes he has restored order, the more he reveals about himself." His companion felt a mixture of awe and dread. Dupin had transformed observation into a weapon, turning the criminal's own mind against him. Yet the brilliance of the strategy was matched by the danger inherent in confronting an intellect capable of such meticulous manipulation. One misstep, one misjudgment might provoke the wrong reaction, perhaps an act of violence or disappearance that would erase every trace. Dupin's face, illuminated by the faint glow of the candle, reflected not triumph but the gravity of their pursuit. "The criminal's obsession is his weakness," he said. "We cannot attack him directly, for he anticipates such moves. But indirect influence, suggestion, the illusion of opportunity, these are irresistible to a mind that prizes control above all. And tonight we have glimpsed the first signs of his unraveling." He leaned closer, whispering, "Mark my words, the next steps will require precision, patience, and restraint. The criminal's confidence is fragile. One misperception, one subtle disturbance, and the pattern begins to reveal itself fully. But we must remain vigilant. The mind that constructs such intricate deception may yet retaliate unpredictably." Hours passed as they catalogued the traces of the intruder. Each footprint, each misaligned object, each handprint in dust was meticulously recorded. Dupin interpreted every detail, reconstructing the movements and intentions of a criminal whose cunning approached genius. Yet despite his brilliance, a sense of danger lingered, an awareness that the criminal had not yet committed the final error, and that the next misstep might come at a cost they could not predict. At last, Dupin stepped back from the scene, his expression unreadable. "We have drawn him out," he said. "The first slip has occurred, and the mind behind this crime is already adjusting. Tomorrow, another suggestion, another subtle provocation, and with each, he will inch closer to the point where he cannot resist revealing everything. Patience, observation, and manipulation, these are our instruments." and through them, the criminal will expose the entirety of his design. As they departed into the fog-laden streets, the air seemed charged with anticipation. Every shadow could conceal intent. Every passerby might unknowingly carry a message to the criminal. His companion walked behind Dupin, aware of the tension coiled in his posture, of the precision with which he interpreted the world, and of the delicate balance between revelation and danger. It became clear that the investigation had evolved into a game of intellect and instinct, a battle of perception extending beyond the body and the obvious evidence into the very architecture of the mind. The psychological trap was set, and the criminal, already in motion, would soon stumble. Yet the outcome remained uncertain, for a mind capable of orchestrating such a crime might yet surprise them in ways both clever and terrifying. That night Paris breathed quietly beneath the fog, unaware of the invisible chessboard spread across its streets. And in that stillness, Dupin and his companion prepared for the next move, a subtle challenge, a careful provocation, knowing that the criminal's obsession would soon compel him to act, and that in that action, the truth, long concealed, would begin to emerge. Chapter 7. The morning air in Paris was sharp, carrying the scent of damp stone and the distant tang of the Seine. Yet the city felt strangely subdued, as if it sensed the culmination of events hidden beneath the ordinary bustle of commerce and routine. Dupin and his companion walked along the narrow streets, the latter's mind restless, anticipating what he knew would be a profound unveiling of both method and motive. Dupin's pace was unhurried, but every step seemed deliberate, every glance attuned to nuance. "We are approaching the moment when the fog of illusion must be lifted," he said quietly. All previous chapters, the false solution, the minor errors, the psychological manipulations, have been carefully orchestrated to prepare for understanding. And understanding requires patience as much as perception. They arrived at the Rue de la Verrerie, where the murder had occurred weeks prior. The building itself, now silent and still, seemed to contain the memory of the crime. Dupin's eyes scanned every window, every sill, every shadow. "The truth is rarely visible in the immediate evidence," he murmured. "It resides in the interplay of actions, in the psychology of those involved, and in the subtle patterns left by an intellect consumed with control." They began their review systematically. First, the victim's room. Dupin gestured to the desk. "Consider the ledger. To the untrained eye, it was merely disarranged. But the order of entries, the slight abrasions along the margins, the indentation of the quill, all betray the presence of another mind, one attempting to impose structure where none was required. The criminal was meticulous, yet the smallest inconsistency betrays obsession. Next, he led his companion to the window. "The glass here," he said, pointing to a faint smudge invisible except to a careful observer, "reveals the intruder's repeated surveillance." He did not act on impulse but calculated the victim's movements, establishing a mental map of behavior. Each slight imperfection in his method is a footprint of his thought process, and it is these footprints that expose him. Dupin's eyes gleamed with a fervor not often seen. "Now observe the tavern in the Marais. The whispers we elicited, the careful placement of objects, these were not merely distractions for the criminal. They were tests. Each action we encouraged prompted him to reveal a fragment of his design. And he obliged, compelled by his obsessive need to control perception." His companion followed Dupin's gaze as he traced the paths the criminal had taken, noting footprints and depressions in dust that the police had ignored. "The first error was minor," Dupin explained, "but deliberate observation transformed it into a thread leading inexorably toward comprehension." He corrected what he perceived as disorder, unaware that in doing so he was drawing a map of his own mind. Dupin paused, turning toward his companion. "Do you see the pattern?" It is not merely the physical act of murder that must be understood, but the intellectual architecture behind it. The criminal's motivation was rooted in envy, yes, but more profoundly in obsession. The need to assert superiority, to manipulate perception, to dominate reality itself. The murder was a statement, executed with precision and misdirection. He led his companion back to the street outside the victim's residence. "Consider the false solution," he continued. The police were drawn to a convenient suspect because the narrative they preferred seemed logical. But logic, when untempered by subtle observation, is blind to complexity. The criminal understood this, relying on expectation to mask his own movements. Yet his obsession could not resist the lure of imperfection. His compulsion betrayed him. Dupin's attention then turned to the tavern once more. Leclerc provided a clue dismissed by authorities. The victim felt watched, observed by an unseen presence. That perception, once ridiculed, was entirely accurate. The criminal had established a pattern of surveillance, ensuring that the victim's environment was continuously monitored. Every movement, every interaction, every hesitation was anticipated, catalogued, and exploited. The genius of the crime lay in its orchestration, not in brute violence. They moved from one location to the next, each revealing another layer of the criminal's design. Dupin reconstructed the timeline with meticulous care, noting that minor deviations, footsteps too shallow, window latches adjusted slightly, dust displaced inconsistently, revealed intentional misdirection. "Every subtlety has meaning," he explained, "and the meaning, when assembled, forms a portrait of intellect and obsession." At last, he drew his companion back to the room where the ledger rested. "The final insight," Dupin said, "is that the criminal's mistake was not in the act itself, but in his arrogance. He believed himself invisible, believing that the ordinary mind could never decipher his work. But obsession, by its nature, demands perfection, and perfection leaves the faintest trace. That trace is enough for a mind trained in observation and deduction to reconstruct the entirety of his design." Dupin produced a diagram, drawn swiftly on a scrap of paper. It traced the criminal's movements, the sequence of surveillance, the placement of objects, the timing of minor interactions, and the deliberate distractions planted to encourage error. Each line, each notation, revealed a mental landscape of meticulous calculation, obsession, and vulnerability. "The criminal's error," he said finally, pointing to the diagram, "was to assume that control is absolute. Every step he took was dictated by the compulsion to maintain order, and in that compulsion, he revealed himself. The murder, the false solution, the minor errors, the responses to subtle provocation, all were orchestrated into a puzzle. And the solution lies in observing the patterns, not merely the isolated acts." His companion felt a shiver as the clarity of Dupin's explanation settled over him. The crime was no longer a simple act of malice. It was an intellectual performance, each move calculated to achieve a desired perception. And yet, within that meticulous framework, the criminal had left the smallest imperfection, enough for Dupin to follow the thread to its source. Dupin's expression darkened. "Tonight we will confront him. The evidence is sufficient, the pattern undeniable, and his own obsession will force him into action. But we must be precise. The criminal is clever, and arrogance may provoke violence. We proceed with caution, yet with the confidence that his design has been unraveled." As the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting the narrow streets into shadows, it became clear that the investigation had transformed. It was no longer merely a search for facts. It was a confrontation of minds, an intellectual duel in which observation, patience, and insight were weapons. The criminal's brilliance had been formidable, yet Dupin's understanding surpassed it, exposing the vulnerability inherent in obsessive control. His companion felt a mixture of relief and tension. Relief because the fog of mystery had been lifted, tension because the confrontation remained imminent, and the criminal, aware or unaware of exposure, could act unpredictably. Every detail had been accounted for, yet the human element, pride, fear, desperation, remained. Dupin's final words lingered as they prepared to move. Observe how the mind constructs its own chains even as it seeks freedom. The criminal's genius was formidable, yet it was also his undoing. Tonight we witness the culmination of intellect, obsession, and error. And when the last move is made, justice, however morally complicated, will be achieved. As they stepped into the dim, fog-laden streets, the sense of anticipation was palpable. Paris, silent and expectant, seemed to hold its breath. Every shadow could conceal intent, every corner might betray movement. And it was clear that the final confrontation would reveal not only the criminal's identity, but the full scope of his intellect and obsession. The game was nearing its conclusion, and Dupin's mind, sharper than ever, was prepared to illuminate the darkness. Chapter 8. The streets of Paris were shrouded in fog, the gas lamps flickering faintly, casting elongated shadows that danced across the cobblestones. Every sound, the distant toll of a bell, the scuff of a horse's hooves, the whisper of wind through narrow alleys, seemed amplified, charged with a sense of foreboding. Dupin and his companion moved cautiously, their steps deliberate, following the trail he had meticulously reconstructed. Tonight the pattern would converge, and the criminal, finally cornered by his own obsession, would confront them in turn. Dupin paused before a narrow doorway, its surface darkened by smoke and age. "Here," he said, his voice calm yet taut with intensity. "This is where he believes himself invisible, yet he is not. Our trap has been laid and his compulsion will draw him in." His companion glanced at him, apprehension gnawing at his nerves. They had followed the criminal's errors, interpreted the minutest of his gestures, and orchestrated subtle provocations. Yet the anticipation of a direct encounter, the meeting of intellects, was unlike anything previously experienced. Dupin's eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the doorway, the surrounding alley, the faint glow from a nearby lamp. "Observe," he said, "how fear and arrogance intermingle. The mind that orchestrates crime with precision is also the mind most prone to desperation when its designs are threatened. He believes he controls every perception, every action. Tonight that belief will falter." They entered quietly, their steps muffled by the uneven flagstones. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wax, old wood, and neglect. The room, dimly lit, contained the faint impression of recent activity. A chair slightly moved, papers subtly disturbed, a candle half consumed. Dupin's gaze fell upon each detail, his mind reading the invisible script written by obsession and anxiety. A sound, soft, deliberate, alerted them. Footsteps, hesitant yet purposeful, approached from the far corner. Dupin's hand brushed his companion's in a gesture of caution. "Patience," he whispered. "Observe, but do not engage prematurely." The figure emerged from the shadows, tall, thin, with a pallor that suggested both intellect and inner tension. His eyes darted about the room, noting what was real and what was suggested. Every gesture betrayed his compulsive need to assert control. Every glance revealed anxiety masked by meticulous calculation. Dupin stepped forward, calm and commanding. "You believe yourself unobserved," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Yet you have been followed, studied, and anticipated at every step. Your errors, though minor in isolation, reveal a pattern as inescapable as your own obsession." The criminal's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition and fear passing over his face. He attempted to retreat, but the doorway was narrow, the shadows behind them closing the path. His movements were careful, almost rehearsed, yet there was a tremor in his hands. Dupin continued, each word deliberate, each syllable designed to provoke introspection. You orchestrated every detail of this crime, yet you could not resist the compulsion to correct what you perceived as disorder. That compulsion has betrayed you. Every trace, every hesitation, every adjustment has left a roadmap to your intellect, and it is upon this map that I have navigated. The criminal's lips pressed tightly together, his eyes scanning for escape, yet the tension in his posture betrayed panic. He had believed himself unseen, untouchable, yet every assumption he had relied upon had been anticipated, every move predicted. "I never intended to confront you physically," Dupin said, "for the mind is far more revealing than force. You will speak, whether through confession or through the subtle reveal of your own behavior." And in that revelation truth emerges. The man swallowed, his hands tightening into fists. Then, almost imperceptibly, he began to speak, words halting, careful, each one betraying both pride and anxiety. He admitted, first in fragments, then more fully, the intricacies of the crime, the surveillance, the calculated errors intended to mislead, the psychological manipulations designed to ensure the victim's fear. He described his motive: envy, obsession, the desire to assert dominance over a world he believed indifferent. Dupin listened, silent yet fully engaged, his mind piecing together every subtle admission, every nuance of speech, every hesitation. "You believed," Dupin said finally, "that intelligence alone could shield you from scrutiny. Yet intelligence untempered by humility is as revealing as any footprint or handprint. Your intellect, applied without restraint, has mapped itself onto the world for those trained to observe." The criminal's face twisted, a mixture of rage and resignation. He attempted to justify his actions, citing slighted ambitions, perceived slights, imagined affronts. Dupin allowed him to speak, guiding the confession subtly, asking questions that revealed further patterns, exposing the obsessive structure of his reasoning. Hours seemed to pass in silence, punctuated by the soft click of Dupin's observations and the nervous cadence of the criminal's explanations. The confession, though incomplete, provided enough to reconstruct the entirety of the murder and its orchestration. Every misleading clue, every minor error, every staged observation fell into place, forming a tapestry of deliberate design. Finally, Dupin stepped closer, his expression composed yet resolute. "And now the final truth," he said. "You acted not out of passion, nor desperation, nor accidental misjudgment. Every element of the crime was chosen, every misdirection considered, every impression calculated. Yet your obsession with control, the very trait that made you dangerous, has undone you. It has revealed your intellect, your psychology, and ultimately your identity." The criminal's shoulders slumped, the pretense of dominance crumbling. He had been ensnared, not by physical force, but by observation, deduction, and the patient orchestration of psychological insight. The web he had spun so carefully had become the very means of his exposure. Dupin turned to his companion, his expression almost gentle. "Observe the lesson," he said. "Genius untempered by restraint, intelligence without humility, obsession unmitigated by reflection. These are the elements that unravel even the most intricate of designs. The criminal is revealed not merely by his actions, but by the architecture of his mind." The authorities arrived shortly thereafter, guided by Dupin's precise instructions. The criminal was taken into custody without incident, his confession corroborated by the subtle evidence Dupin had collected. Yet the resolution was not simple. The brilliance of the crime and the subtlety of the criminal's intellect left a lingering unease. Justice had been achieved, but the moral complexity of the case weighed heavily on the mind. As they left the scene, Dupin's gaze lingered on the fog-laden streets. "Paris appears ordinary," he said, "yet beneath its surface lies an architecture of thought, perception, and behavior. Tonight, A mind that sought to dominate that architecture has been revealed. Yet the city itself remains unchanged, silent, and indifferent to the machinations of those who walk its streets. A chill settled over his companion, realizing that the resolution of the murder did not dispel the sense of unease. The criminal's intellect had been formidable, yet his obsession had undone him. And in the shadows of Paris, the delicate balance between brilliance and folly, obsession and insight, continued to shape the lives of those who dared to observe too closely. Dupin paused, glancing back at the narrow alley where the confrontation had occurred. "Remember," he said, "that the greatest mysteries are rarely solved by force or haste. They yield only to observation, patience, and the careful reading of mind and motive. The truth is rarely obvious. It resides in the hidden architecture of perception." And with that, they walked away, the fog curling around their feet, the gas lamps casting long, wavering shadows. Behind them, the criminal had been unmasked, yet the sense of lingering dread remained. For Paris, in its endless complexity, held countless minds, each capable of brilliance and darkness, each capable of deception and revelation. And the game, as Dupin knows, was never truly over. The city breathed on, silent and watchful, as they disappeared into the night, the truth revealed yet leaving its haunting trace, like a shadow that lingers long after the candle has burned low.